Hello, 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 LinkedIn and YouTube. Welcome to Diverse Voices, where we talk to leaders about their perspective on key topics. Today, we're talking to the great Gerald Hutchinson. And I say great. Hi, Gerald.
Hi, Michael.
I say great because I've known you for a number of years. You were actually my first coach.
That's very flattering of you. Thank you.
Well, what I think I've come to appreciate is, though I've known you for a while, I learned things in our recent discussion. I did not realize that the PhD and the letters mean something, that you're a psychologist.
Counseling psychology, right?
Counseling. So I've been counseled.
Well, that's a little bit of an interesting story. I was the director of the outdoor leadership program at Davidson College, and I wanted to get into the field of coaching and consulting. And at that time, it seemed all the people who were anybody had a PhD. So I looked around who is doing leadership development training, coaching, and it was Center for Creative Leadership based here in Greensboro, and I decided I would get a PhD here and go from there. But I focused really on organizational behavior. So it wasn't so much like marriage and family counseling or individual trauma counseling. It was really just a means to an end to get my ticket punched. So I could be called doctor. It's a little vainglorious, quite frankly.
Well, listen, you can get yourself a couple of letters after your name. It's the hard work paying off, and showcasing a bit of that doesn't hurt.
No, it doesn't.
No. I am really curious, though, for those of us, I know what organizational development is, but for those who are in the audience, talk to me a little bit about the science of organizational development and how that relates to coaching.
Okay. So, not to go too far back, but basically organization development is thinking about how to make your organization function at a higher level. And you can do that from the financial standpoint, from the operations standpoint, from the sales and marketing standpoint, or from the people and culture standpoint. And that's really the framework that OD, organization development, uses. And it really contains a whole host of things, from change management, culture change, high performance, succession planning and training, development, that sort of thing, as well as executive and leadership coaching.
So you understand the full gamut of organizations and key components, and have just focused your effort and energy on the huge channel of coaching.
Yes, and teamwork. Because I discovered early on in my coaching career that if you work with one individual and you make them more better, right? And then they go back into an environment that doesn't support them, it's really wasted effort. And they typically get frustrated and want to move somewhere else. And that's not the goal. The goal is to help executives work within their environment, and everybody, the rising tide concept, everybody is supporting one another to improve their performance, create a better culture, create a better workplace.
I can definitely see the contextualization of helping someone be better at the role, be better as a leader, be a better manager, and then tying together with what are the systemic issues within that organization and how can we address them? Because one of the main reasons a lot of people will leave their role is because their manager isn't great. But then there are organizations that won't necessarily spend the time to invest in making managers better, because that can be indicative that their manager's not the best that they can be, or in a position. So it can talk to, it might just be an isolated incident. There's implications.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
I am curious though, as we're talking right ahead, I'll why a little delay in our feed.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. This is technology, isn't it? All that fiber optic cable doesn't seem to be pulling its weight right now.
That's okay. We'll blame it on New York because that's where I am. But I'd love to talk a little bit about the good and bad, ugly of executive coaching. And I thought a good place to start would be talking about the organizations themselves, back into our discussion of teamwork and some of the, creating a great manager and helping foster their growth through coaching is wonderful. But there may be reasons that organizations don't consider embracing executive coaching. In your 30 years, what have you seen most often holds organizations back from making that decision?
The number one reason is arrogance, quite frankly. An organization or the senior executives think that they've got it made, that they don't need the insight, the perspective, as well as the knowledge. And so I say arrogance. There's a little narcissism that's tied into that. I would say you scratch the surface of that and you get some insecurity. Because on the one hand, many organizations these days are preaching the idea of continuous improvement about the whole organization. And yet, if executives themselves are not willing to embrace continuous improvement about themselves, or if it's not necessarily about themselves, just about how they lead, then the hypocrisy, of course, is obvious, and it is typically not that healthy a culture. It's not that high-performing organization. At least it won't be able to sustain it. So the good is when an organization wants to, and the senior executives want to improve, and they understand that the organization reflects them, right? If they want the organization to improve, they themselves have to improve and have to role model that improvement and that seeking of how can I be better as a leader, better in my leadership, better in my teamwork with my other senior leaders, and cascade that culture, that desire for improved performance throughout, not just exclusively about the operational outcomes or the financial outcomes, but understanding that the relationships among people, the communication, the teamwork is really a mechanism to get there.
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by your statements that if leaders aren't willing to invest in their own coaching, that may be indicative of their own limitations or their own thoughts about where they stand in their career and their stance in the organization.
Right.
Do you find that there are a lot of CEOs who have a coach? They may not talk about it, but they dabble or always have someone to talk to as an outsider to guide them through their process?
Well, the whole idea of a board of directors is to provide perspective and counsel. Many boards of directors are merely glamorous rubber stamp operations for whatever the CEO wants to do. But my experience is that over the last 30 years is that more and as really the leadership, which typically in larger corporations is kind of 50, 60 years old, well, they've been aging out, and who's been coming up is people who do have more of a desire to personally get coached. They understand it. They're much more willing and open to get that. There's still a percentage of senior executives who are overly sure of themselves, right? That's the arrogance. Overly sure of themselves that they don't need coaching, that they've got it all figured out, or they can figure it out on the fly, which is a little bit of vanity, right, of the narcissist. But more and more, even if, I mean, I've got a little narcissist in me as well, right? But I understand that I need a coach. I need that perspective. I need that outside voice of reason to keep me in line. And my experience is more and more senior executives are also moving into that framework.
I really appreciate, in essence, the fallibility that you've just brought up. And I wonder what the stories that some leaders tell themselves that's preventing them from engaging within a coach. You know, I'm good enough, I know enough, I've got this. Nonetheless, if those things really held true, do they blame their relative lack of success, again, not knowing what their organizational goals might be, where that lack of success is someone else's fault, right? The team's not good enough. But as we know, as a leader, the team that you put together is a reflection of the choices that you've made.
That's right.
You're selecting some of that talent. You're grooming some of that talent to be better. And if you don't have a growth mindset, why would you expect your teams to have one, or the key players in your teams to have one? So I'm really curious. I really start to be to wonder where that growth mindset can play a role. So is there something, what is the role of growth mindset in coaching?
It's absolutely essential. So I've engaged in senior leadership team transformation projects, right? Where somebody, it could be the HR person, it could be the COO, it could be the CFO or the CEO. I guess a third category is, or fourth and fifth, whatever, CIO and CPO, Chief People Officer, or whatever the type of title is. But somebody says, you know what, we've got some opportunities here, we've got some challenges. What we've been doing isn't working. We need to change. And when the senior team embraces that, and typically there's a span of that embrace, right? Some of them are much more cautious, guarded, and others are much more open for that. But as long as the doors open a little bit and they understand, hey, you know what, this could be really beneficial for me, then coaching works really well. When they're overly guarded and they think, yeah, I don't need this. Why are you doing this to me? I've got my act together. And the only problem is everybody else is not doing their job. You know, coaching doesn't work. That's the bad part of coaching. You know, we want to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly. And of course, the ugliest is the flaming narcissist that is so sure of themselves and actually creates a toxic environment. And unfortunately, it takes a little narcissism. It takes a little self-belief, or, you know, that arrogance to propel oneself into the upper echelons of corporation. The problem is that when that isn't matured and seasoned with an understanding of teamwork and humility and the willingness to keep that open growth mindset, that it becomes a big problem.
I really appreciate that. It's just that open door, that willingness to change. And then I guess it can really depend upon the pairing of the coach that either you as a leader have selected to partner with, or the coach who has been selected for you by HR or by other leaders or by the board.
Yeah. 1000%.
You know, I start to consider, how important is it to have a coach who's going to push you and challenge you as an outsider, rather than just sort of let every session be a bit of therapy and a bit of unloading versus goal-oriented.
Right. So I think a good coach creates a balance, right? because it is lonely at the top, and executives and senior leaders need therapy. They need somebody where they can truly ventilate, and it's safe and it's confidential and it's trusted, and word's not going to get back out that I'm complaining about this person or this situation and making me look bad, right? They need that opportunity to ventilate. But I would also say, or I should say and, not but, because it is an additive. And the additive value is when the coach can actually challenge. And I believe a good coach does that, does not just allow the situation to be where it is. And of course, some of the fit is how challenging will the coachee allow the coach to be without rejecting the coach.
Sure.
And there is a fit, there's a chemistry. It's like human relationships. We get along better with some people than others. We're willing to, open our kimono, so to speak, to use your beautiful Oriental artwork behind you, and disclose, who we really are and what we really think and what's really going on. And that is an aspect of fit between the coach and the coachee. Now, I'll also say that some coaches are much better at shaping themselves to fit a wide variety of personalities. And, I would say now that I've been doing this for 30 years, I'm much better at shaping myself to fit with so many different types of personalities. But I will be honest, I really still have problems with the real narcissist. They're very difficult to coach. Psychology informs us that they just think that they've got their act together. So even if they somehow desire coaching, they still are resistant to thinking, I need to change something about the way that I interact with people, or the way I lead my organization.
In my experience, there's a lot of goal setting that benefits coachees coming into that relationship, no matter your level of a mid-level manager, upper level, or C-suite. It's, hi, nice to meet you, chemistry test. Here's what I'm trying to accomplish for the next 3 months, 6 months, year, and why I'm hoping to partner with a coach.
That's right.
So you touched on the idea of safety. So it's a safe space, and the ability to have that real conversation is an imperative. But how important is goal setting in that relationship of coaching and coachee?
Well, that's a great question, Michael. What a goal does is gives a focus to the coaching, which if you don't have that goal, it just becomes a therapy session, right? And it just becomes kind of vague, and it kind of loses its emphasis. So I strongly encourage my clients to say, okay, what do you need to do better in your organization? What's the outcomes that you want to have that are better, the challenges that you're experiencing, and then coach to those challenges. And what they do is, of course, they open up to, how do I need to lead differently? Because it becomes then leadership is a tool. My behavior, my vocalizations, my body language, how much I show up, who do I look, who am I making eye contact with in a meeting? How much am I working to create a great communication channel with people that I might otherwise just ignore, but I do it because it will get me the outcome that I want, right? And so having those goals, those organizational goals, not just developing as a leader goal, but it's almost like you develop as a leader because you're trying to achieve something in the organization. And I find that there are some types of people who want to learn more as themselves as a leader, and others that at least I've been able to do. I get into that because these are the organizational outcomes they want to achieve.
Yeah, and I start thinking of the context of that idea of goal setting and change, where, to your point, how that leader shows up, if they're in an environment where either they're a new leader and they didn't create the culture, they're just adopting and adapting to the culture to try to find ways of modifying that culture, there becomes the opportunity to figure out who in the room and who, how the audience receives certain pieces of information. I'm often taken with, from Gallup Strengths, the idea of strengths coaching, understanding the key players and the way in which they receive information and the way they may respond to information. So someone who may be very insightful and thoughtful may not be giving you a reaction to a statement you're making because they're processing, while others may be very high communicative and therefore are speaking in that moment and giving you, visual and verbal and nonverbal cues about how they're receiving the information. Is part of coaching also guiding that leader to understand something beyond themselves?
Oh, they've got to have that outside in perspective. Yeah. And of course, you mentioned, the Gallup Strengths Finder, Clifton Strengths Finder. I'm not sure what the current way of pronouncing it is, or the label, but whether it's that or any other psychological profiles, personality profiles, or 360 information. It used to be, until about 10 years ago, that many people never saw themselves except in a mirror. And they never heard themselves except just talking, unless they occasionally would see themselves on a video recording and hear themselves and go, oh, I had no idea I really looked that way. Because a mirror, I just see this, but in a video, I see this, and I hear myself, and I had no idea. Well, now people are much more clear. And so that outside perspective it's just easier. I think people are much more open to it now, which is really fascinating to me, about how this technological transformation has made people understand that, hey, just because I see myself this way, other people see myself, from all these different angles. And therefore getting a 360, meaning input from all the people, for people who may not be familiar with the term, input from people that surround and work with the individual. That's what 360 means, all the different degrees. It is still illuminating and insightful, but I'm finding that there's less. This is interesting. There's less, oh, I had no idea I came across that way.
I recognize the value of 360s, and I know a lot of HR teams will perform some type of 360, usually written. They scrub it of verbatims. My experience is in coaching, that conversation and capturing the actual words people use helps others see themselves with a great deal more clarity than a survey or something that's a bit more anonymized.
I couldn't agree more, and I personally get rather aggravated when I find that an organization I'm working with has used a survey type of 360. In fact, I would make a statement with a caveat, with a condition, that survey-based 360s do more harm than good. If you're going to do a 360, I think it needs to be interview-based. There needs to be verbatim words that are anonymized, okay? Because we know that people often don't take even constructive criticism well. It hurts them, and they sometimes want to lash out at people that hurt them in some way. So that's the purpose of the anonymity. But given that richness of those words and those perspectives, in an interview format as opposed to just even writing it out. And people get fatigued these days after writing like one sentence or 3 sentences if they're typing. You know, there's just not the richness of information. So you give people the opportunity to talk and do those interviews, and the value, the quality of the 360 is immensely improved.
Oh, I can appreciate that the qualitative information you're gleaning from the conversation is going to be so much more rewarding, because the nuance of detail that's captured by actual language that people speak a lot faster than they type is going to give you, as a coach, the ability to leverage the safe space that you've created in the beginning of your relationship at that moment of a 360 to talk a little bit more about, you know, here's how you're being seen. You thought you were being viewed in a certain way, and it's actually not holding up that way. That the elements that you thought were your assets may be your assets, but this detractor is playing a bigger role in the way you're being seen than otherwise.
Absolutely. It's like you get a rock in your shoe, a little pebble, right? And you can be walking just fine, but that little thing, that little aggravating thing just takes your attention, right? And this is how, this is the value of doing a 360. You might be doing great, but there's this one little thing you're doing that nobody's really told you about. And I'm going to, you know, we have 2 more minutes. I want to tell an ugly, right?
We can keep going. I love good stories.
Okay. So I was working with one organization. I'm not even going to mention the industry because the story's kind of gross. But this guy in his team meetings, this executive in his team meetings would reach over and grab the trash can and blow out a honker, right, into the trash can. It was disgusting, right? I mean, that's disgusting in a team meeting.
Yes. Yes.
And nobody told him that. I had to do it. And of course, he immediately went, oh my gosh, that is so stupid. I can see how gross that is now, and I will never do it again.
Sure. We become so caught up in our sense of self, and we forget that some moments aren't as private as they may be in our head. Even though we know we're in a room, we've lost all contextual reason.
Exactly.
It's fascinating. I like that we are talking a little bit more about the way that people see themselves versus the way they're seen by others. I thought a good portion of time could be spent on imposter syndrome, because there's been a lot of conversation around it as of late. People, you know, addressing these issues from the psychological damage and the psychological weight that they're holding. So I'm curious if we could talk a little bit about what role does imposter syndrome play in coaching itself?
So there's 2 sides. Does someone, are they aware that they feel like an imposter? And then can the coach see that they feel that they are an imposter? Those are 2 different things, and they require 2 different types of responses. If they understand that they feel like an imposter, then we're dealing fundamentally, we can deal transparently and authentically with the insecurity, right? Imposter syndrome means I don't feel like I belong here. I'm an imposter. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not talented enough. I'm not whatever. And, you know, that's a very healthy conversation, because as I learned in my doctoral program, you know, 98% of the population has some degree of insecurity. You know, the 2% who don't are psychopaths or sociopaths, and, you know, they should have some insecurity, but they, you know, fundamentally are messed up in the head. I mean, that's what we found out. The insecurity, of course, causes us to as humans. It causes us to try and compensate for that. And we can work too hard to convince someone else that we are what we wish we would be seen as. And that overwork, that overcompensation leads to inauthentic leadership. Mm-hmm. It leads to making demands of others that we ourselves could not uphold. And it really leads to a level of anxiety and stress that are very unhealthy. So, and of course that precipitates throughout the relationships, whether professional as well as personal. So someone who recognizes that they feel like an imposter, or they feel like they just don't have it, that's a great coaching conversation. When someone is in this vein of, and there's a little bit of, I suppose, narcissism there, that they may think that they're the greatest, but in fact they're not, and they are truly kind of an imposter, that's a little bit harder to broach, and that's a little bit harder to deal with. And that's when the coach has to step up and say, hey, look, either using the 360 or using a profile like the Strengths Finder or any other tool, any other opportunity, find out, hey, you are not what you think that you are, right? You're not coming across in the way that you think you are. So that's a different imposter, if you will, right? It's a different type of imposter.
Sure. And I find that expression really interesting, because some organizations may elect to give a leader a coach as a one-off, and there are other organizations that may look at it from equity, which is, I'm a leader and I'm being coached, and I'm going to allocate within my budget for 10 other individuals at a certain tier to be coached as well. So I can see that if someone is an imposter and doesn't know it, and is making an outsized impact on the organization, breaking them of that habit and helping them to see themselves for the truth that they are, can really start to evolve a culture, because they could unintentionally be a logjam in some degree of culture change. So I'm wondering, what's coaching's impact on culture change? Whether through the lens or otherwise, what can coaching's impact be on changing a culture for the better?
Right. So systems theory says that you change one small element and everything changes, right? And there's some truth in that, but there's also the leadership amplification effect. And that is that people follow the leader. Mm-hmm. They mold and model their behavior based upon what they see from the leader, at least up to a certain point. And some people may not be familiar with Enron, the giant energy firm based in Texas that, mm-hmm. They were doing a lot of bad things. And it was a go, drive, we can overcome, we're the best, we're the smartest. But let's not let ethics get in the way of doing some things, which I use that to illustrate the point that people follow their leaders. So if we can coach leaders and coach them to think of, gosh, maybe I've got something that I need to improve on, and maybe I'm going to engage in a process, a coaching process, to improve myself and improve how I lead, this will trickle down. People follow the leader. Organizations are now. Organizations do follow the leader, but large organizations made up of thousands of people, they may not necessarily follow the CEO that gets the glamour and the Wall Street accolades and that sort of thing. They may be following the leader who is the senior vice president of marketing or the senior vice president of operations. And so consequently, well, who do they follow? Well, they're following the executive vice president, and the presidents,
Right.
and they're calling the CEO. So there's that trickle down. And it can have an impact, but there can be much more localized, not necessarily culture in the grandest scheme, but more climate, what's called organizational climate, which is typically what's going on more around you immediately, as opposed to this bigger culture piece.
Sure. And when we talk about culture, and you mentioned behavior, I often equate it to a culture is defined by the behavior of its leaders in the darkest moments, in the most challenging moments. So if someone in the C-suite has demonstrated behavior in a dark moment, in a rough moment among the SVPs, that similar behavior rolling down, when there's a rough moment within that team, and the SVP has demonstrated a type of behavior, that's now going to be a taught behavior, an observed behavior. And it creates some opportunities, I think, that where coaching can intercede and intersect those behaviors and create new behaviors, create tangential behaviors that are for the benefit of the organization.
Absolutely.
So I am curious that if we talk about it, what are the qualities of a coachable manager?
Well, a growth mindset. It's the most important one. A willingness to examine oneself and say, hey, yeah, I don't have everything together. And I'll be honest, I think that the Strengths Finder as a tool is absolutely phenomenal for that, because it positions things that, yes, we all have strengths, and we have unique strengths. And coming from that strengths framework, well, guess what? There are some things that you're not as strong in. These muscles are just not as well developed. So you may be a strategist, you may be a maximizer, an achiever, an analyst, and have high strength in that, but you're not as good at people and you don't follow detail very well. Okay. Yeah. That doesn't mean you can't do those things. It's just those aren't the muscles that you prefer to operate with. So, you asked this question: what are the qualities of a coachable manager? The most fundamental one, and I think it really just boils down to: do they want to be coached?
Right.
Well,
that openness will allow them to thrive in the organization, and they may not, just because they've been given the role, they've arrived at their role or their promotion, they haven't really found a way to push the business, push their sector, push their team in a positive direction, right, allowing them to thrive and overachieve relative to the rest of the culture.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, how do they get spun up? Now, I've got to say something, noticing our time. I've got a client in just a few minutes that I'm going to have to jump off the call for.
That's a good sign.
And do some coaching. So,
well, that's perfect. Gerald, it's always a pleasure talking with you. I know we normally have sidebar conversations, but I think that there's a lot about coaching that can be great. I've had those experiences.
Totally.
Sometimes it's less than optimal, and people have had those bad experiences, and sometimes it's just ugly, but sometimes get a little messy. You can discover something about yourself that to grow in a beautiful way. So I appreciate you spending a little time with us today. I'm sure you're going to have an amazing time with Coachy, and and there'll be more conversations to come.
Sounds great, Michael. Thanks for the conversation. It's always a great pleasure speaking with you.
Pleasure as well. All right. Bye, all.
All right.